All right, let's dive into this. The Cold War. We've got a ton of research here, mostly from Wikipedia articles on the Cold War and the Soviet Empire.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating, right? Espionage, nuclear threats, global tension.
It's a period that, still has a huge impact on the world today. What was just about tanks and missiles,
Right.
a clash of ideologies, it shaped everything for decades.
Okay, so we've got these two superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, facing off. But, it didn't just come out of nowhere, right? What events kind of set the stage for this?
Well, even before World War II, there was this underlying mistrust going back to the 1917 Russian
The
Revolution.
Bolsheviks, right?
Exactly. They really spooked the Western Allies. Then you've got the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in World War I.
Yeah. Didn't that just pour gasoline on the fire?
Absolutely. A young Soviet Russia had to give up huge chunks of territory to Germany. Resentment, suspicion, it all just festered.
So even when they had to team up against the Nazis in World War II,
That tension was simmering below the surface.
totally. So after the war, things really went south, huh?
Yeah, disagreements over rebuilding Europe. The Soviets wanted a buffer zone in Eastern Europe for their own security, they said. The U.S. and its allies, they wanted democratic governments, open markets.
Two completely different visions. So when do we officially say, Dome, the Cold War has begun?
It's debated, but a lot of historians point to 1947. That's when you see the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan.
Containment, like trying to hold back this giant wave. But wait, wasn't it actually hot in some places?
Oh, absolutely. Proxy wars like Syria, Vietnam, Afghanistan, superpowers backing different sides, local conflicts turning international.
And of course, the nuclear arms race. I mean, just thinking about that constant threat of annihilation.
It's hard to even imagine living with that fear day in and day out.
Let's talk about some of those key events. The Berlin blockade in '48 really jumps out. So Berlin, this divided city.
Deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany. But the U.S., Britain, France-controlled sectors of Berlin.
An island of Western influence, right in the middle of Soviet territory.
Yeah, Stalin saw it as a threat, tried to force them out, cutting off all land access to West Berlin.
So was West Berlin just stranded?
Not a chance. The Berlin airlift, it was incredible. For almost a year, cargo planes around the clock, delivering supplies, food, fuel, everything.
Wow, a lifeline from the sky. What a message, both to the Soviets and to the people they control.
It showed the West's commitment, their resolve, and it really highlighted the contrast between the two systems, the freedom and prosperity in the West.
Okay, so you've got these alliances forming, the superpowers facing off with their nukes. Who else is in this global standoff?
Each side built up a network. The U.S. formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in '49, mostly Western European and North American countries, a defensive alliance. Then in '55, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe.
Hold on, satellite states? What's that about?
These were countries in Eastern Europe, think Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. They were technically independent, but under Soviet control. Their governments, their economies, all aligned with Moscow. The Warsaw Pact formalized that, presented a united front against NATO.
So basically choosing sides in this very high-stakes game. You said Eastern Bloc earlier. Same thing, right?
Yeah, another way to refer to those Soviet-influenced countries, behind the Iron Curtain, as they said.
Not just a geographical line, but an ideological, economic one, too.
Exactly.
So the alliances are set, the Cold War is heating up, and this Iron Curtain divides Europe. Feels like the whole world was holding its breath.
And what followed was a series of crises, proxy wars, the arms race. Things could have easily spiraled out of control.
And imagine, if you can, living in that time, that fear, the uncertainty, that constant threat.
The fate of humanity hanging in the balance.
Seriously. And on top of all that, there was another front. Espionage.
Right.
Spy games.
The stakes were incredibly high.
Think James Bond, right?
More John le Carré, actually. Both sides had huge intelligence networks. The KGB for the Soviets, the CIA for the U.S.
It's like a whole other war happening in the shadows. What kind of tactics are we talking about?
The KGB was known for some, pretty ruthless methods. Disinformation, planting false stories to mislead the West, forgery, creating fake documents to mess with diplomatic situations.
Wow.
The CIA had their successes too, infiltrating Soviet institutions, gathering intel. It was a constant back and forth.
So it's not just about military power, but information, secrets, and how you manipulate perceptions.
Absolutely. The Cold War was a multi-front war, and espionage was a key part of it.
You mentioned propaganda earlier. How did that fit in?
It was a way to shape public opinion, both at home and abroad. Radio broadcasts, films, posters, all designed to promote their ideology and demonize the other side.
The U.S. had Voice of America, right? Broadcasting into the Soviet bloc.
And the Soviets had their own methods. It was a battle for hearts and minds.
These ideologies clashing on such a massive scale, not just about land or resources, but about two totally different ways of seeing the world.
And that's what made the Cold War so complex and so dangerous. A clash of titans could have easily become a full-blown war with devastating consequences.
But wait, amidst all this tension, there were moments of cooperation. You're kidding. Tell me more.
It's true, yeah. Even with all that going on, those two superpowers, they did try to find some common ground. It wasn't all just spying and threats. There was this period called détente.
Détente. Huh. So even with the nukes and the suspicion, they, actually talked?
Yeah, starting in the late 60s, going through most of the 70s, tensions eased a bit. Maybe they realized that, pushing each other to the brink of destruction wasn't the best long-term plan.
Makes sense.
They even signed some agreements like the SALT treaties, trying to put some limits on those nuclear arsenals.
SALT, right? The Strategic Arms Limitation talks. They were trying to, rein things in a bit.
Exactly. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, that it was becoming all too real.
Yeah, nobody wins in a nuclear war, right?
Right, and the SALT talks showed that maybe, just maybe, cooperation was the only way to survive.
Did détente lead to anything else besides SALT?
Oh yeah, there were the Helsinki Accords in '75, a whole bunch of issues like human rights, cooperation between East and West,
Wow.
signed by both the U.S. and the Soviets and a lot of other countries, a pretty big diplomatic way.
So détente did things are thawing out a bit. Some hope, maybe, but it didn't last.
Right, sadly no. Détente was always kind of fragile. By the late '70s, things started falling apart.
What happened?
A few things. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in '79. The West saw that as a clear act of aggression.
Breaking international law, right?
Yeah, the U.S. hit them with sanctions, boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics.
Trust was broken, I guess. Old habits die hard. So détente's over, tensions are rising again. What next?
Well, the 1980s got off to a pretty chilly start with Ronald Reagan getting elected in the U.S.
Reagan, huh?
Yeah, a staunch anti-communist, called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He took a much tougher stance. More military spending, a more aggressive foreign policy.
Sounds familiar. Back to the arms race and all that. What did Reagan actually do?
One of his big things was pushing for this thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI.
SDI.
People called it Star Wars.
Like the movies.
Yeah, but a very different kind of Star Wars. Reagan wanted a system in space, something that could shoot down Soviet missiles.
Whoa. Ambitious.
It was hugely ambitious, super expensive, and people argued about whether it was even possible. But it definitely freaked out the Soviets.
So the 80s were pretty tense then. Reagan going head-to-head with the Soviets. Were we close to nuclear war again?
There were some scary close calls. In '83, a NATO military exercise, Able Archer 83, almost caused a real Soviet nuclear response.
Seriously.
It was a simulation of a nuclear attack. The Soviets were already on edge, and they thought it was the real deal, went on high alert. For a little while there, things were really, really dangerous.
That's terrifying. So tension's rising, the arms race is back on, and Reagan's not backing down. But we know it didn't end in nuclear war. What happened?
This is where things take a surprising turn. While all that was happening, a big change was brewing inside the Soviet Union.
Okay, now I'm really interested. Tell me about this change.
In 1985, a new leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was different from any Soviet leader before him.
How so?
He realized that the Soviet system was in trouble. Stagnant, inefficient, needed a major overhaul. He also knew that the arms race was unsustainable, a real danger to the Soviet Union's future.
So he wanted to shake things up.
You could say that. Gorbachev introduced two big ideas: glasnost and perestroika.
Glasnost? Perestroika.
Glasnost meant openness, less censorship, more freedom of speech, a more transparent government. Perestroika meant restructuring. He wanted to fix the Soviet economy, move away from central planning, and try some market-based ideas.
Those are pretty radical changes for the Soviet Union, especially during the Cold War. How did people react?
Glasnost and perestroika had a huge impact. They unleashed forces that, honestly, even Gorbachev couldn't fully control. On one hand, there was a lot of hope, especially among young people. They started speaking out, demanding more rights and freedoms.
But not everyone was happy, right?
No, there was also anxiety, resistance, especially among the old guard in the Communist Party. They saw these reforms as a threat to their power.
A society going through massive changes, trying to figure out what it all meant. Did these reforms affect the Cold War itself?
Absolutely. The changes within the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's willingness to talk to the West had a big impact. He built a relationship with Reagan, and they worked together to reduce nuclear weapons through those arms control agreements.
So, some positive outcomes.
Yeah, but maybe the biggest consequence of Gorbachev's reforms was that the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe started to weaken. Yeah, it's like those reforms were cracks in that Iron Curtain we talked about.
And when those cracks started to widen, what happened?
Well, imagine yourself in one of those Eastern Bloc countries. For decades, you've only known life under Soviet control. Limited freedoms, a constant feeling of being oppressed.
Right.
Then suddenly there's this glimmer of hope, coming from Moscow, no less.
People must have started to believe change was possible.
They did, and they weren't afraid to demand it. Think about the Solidarity movement in Poland.
Ah, yes, Solidarity. A trade union, right? Challenging communist rule.
Exactly. Led by Lech Walesa, Solidarity gained so much power and support, it became a symbol of resistance against the Soviets, a real grassroots movement, people power, and it had this ripple effect across Eastern Europe.
So inspiring. And what about the Berlin Wall coming down in '89? Was that a direct result of Gorbachev's reforms, or were there other things going on?
The fall of the Berlin Wall was a lot of things coming together, but Gorbachev's policies definitely played a part. Protests were happening all over East Germany. People were demanding change. And Gorbachev basically said he wasn't going to send in the tanks.
Wow.
Totally different from what the Soviets had done before, like in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Without Soviet support, the East German government, they couldn't stop what was happening.
Right.
So on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall, this symbol of division and oppression for so long, it just crumbled. People were going back and forth, celebrating like a huge party.
Such a powerful moment. So the Berlin Wall falls, Eastern Europe breaks free. What about the Soviet Union itself? Did it just kind of disappear?
Not exactly. See, Gorbachev wanted to fix the Soviet system with his reforms, but they actually ended up weakening it from the inside.
Unintended consequences.
Yeah. With all that loosening of control, nationalist movements in those Soviet republics, they started demanding more autonomy. Some even wanted complete independence.
So the reforms meant to save the Soviet Union actually helped bring about its end.
Kind of ironic, yeah. And then in August of 91, you had those hardliners in the Communist Party. They were scared of losing power, so they tried to overthrow Gorbachev.
Wait, a coup? In the Soviet Union, what happened?
It failed. A lot of that was thanks to regular people resisting them, led by Boris Yeltsin.
Yeltsin, who became the first president of Russia.
Exactly. But even though the coup failed, it weakened Gorbachev's power. And things started to fall apart even faster. By the end of 91, the Soviet Union, this massive global superpower, it was gone, dissolved into 15 independent republics.
It's almost hard to believe. So the Cold War, this decades-long struggle that shaped the entire world, it ended not with a bang, but with a whimper.
In a way, yeah. But it was still a huge moment in history. The Cold War was over, and the threat of nuclear war, that constant fear, it was finally gone.
And we're left with this complicated legacy, right? How did this conflict, without any direct fighting between the superpowers, how did it change the world?
The Cold War's impact is massive. It affected global politics, alliances, economies, even culture. Yeah, there were more nuclear powers, conflicts left over from those Cold War rivalries, and the scars from those proxy wars. But it also pushed technology forward, like with space exploration and computers, and it changed how we think about international relations, about global power.
It's amazing to think that a war without direct fighting could have such a long-lasting effect. It was about so much more than just weapons. It was a war of ideas and battle for people's hearts and minds, all playing out on this global stage. But we haven't really touched on the human cost. How did the Cold War affect everyday people?
That's a really important point. If you were living behind the Iron Curtain, it meant living under these repressive regimes. No freedom of speech, no freedom of movement, limited opportunities.
Tough to imagine living like that. What about on the other side, the West? How did people experience the Cold War?
In the West, it was a lot of anxiety, paranoia, that threat of nuclear war always looming,
Right.
fueled by the government, by the media. I remember those duck and cover drills in school, fallout shelters. And there was this pressure to conform, this suspicion of anyone who seemed communist or socialist.
So the Cold War really touched every part of life, even for people far away from the actual fighting.
It did. It shaped the world we live in today, even though it ended over 30 years ago. It shows us that even conflicts without direct military battles, they can have a huge and lasting impact.
This has been an amazing deep dive into one of the most important eras of history. I'm really struck by just how complex the Cold War was, and it makes me appreciate peace even more. It's something we shouldn't take for granted.
Absolutely. We have to remember those lessons from the Cold War. It shows how dangerous unchecked rivalry can be, how important diplomacy and communication are, and we need to understand history, its nuances, if we want to deal with all the complex problems in the world today.
Great point. As we wrap up, what stands out to you most about the Cold War? What's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with?
For me, it's the strength of the human spirit. Even with that threat of nuclear war hanging over them, the fear, the division, people on both sides of the Iron Curtain found ways to connect with each other, to fight oppression, and eventually to create change. It reminds us that even when things are really dark, hope and that desire for a better future, they can win out.
That's a powerful message. We've covered so much in this deep dive, the Cold War's beginnings, those major events, the ideologies at play, and how it continues to affect us today. But there's always more to learn. So as you think about this era, consider this. How do those Cold War lessons help us understand what's going on in the world right now? Are there any connections between the ideological battles back there and the divisions we see today? Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.